Good morning and welcome. I'm Alex Matanka, Senior Fellow and Director of the Iran Program at the Middle East Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event organized by the Middle East Institute's Iran Program and Chatham House's MENA Program. Today's panel is called Examining the European Union, Iran, United States Triangle. The Trump administration's May 2018 withdrawal from the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal that was signed in 2015, and unsuccessful US attempts to gain European support for its maximum pressure strategy has meant that France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have taken a different approach in their policies towards Iran. How are countries in the European Union bloc balancing pressures from Washington and Tehran to remain committed to JCPOA principles, or alternatively to apply greater pressure on Iran? Today, I'm pleased to welcome a group of experts who will discuss the triangular challenges and opportunities for Washington, Tehran, and the European Union, three in particular, and consider how the US presidential elections just in a few weeks' time might impact these dynamics. First, I would like to welcome Clement Temeh. Clement is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Nuclear Knowledges Program at JCPOA, as well as research associate at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, and he's joining us today from Paris. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Sanam Vakil. Sanam is the Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow in the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House, and she's joining us today from London. And finally, I would like to introduce Azadeh Zamirirad. Azadeh is the Deputy Head of the Middle East and Africa Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And Azadeh is joining us today from Berlin. A quick admin pointer here. To submit your questions, please use the Zoom Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email again, events@mei.edu. It's important to point out that you are more than welcome to ask questions anytime during this panel. I will be looking for these questions and will factor in as many as I can during the discussion. I have so many questions of my own, but we only have an hour and we have three great minds. So I won't waste any more time. I'll get right to it. We'll start with Azadeh, then we move on to the rest of the panel. And Azadeh, let me start with an easy one for you, if you don't mind. How would you describe Germany's position today vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic of Iran? And a couple of things that I thought might be interesting for an American audience, certainly, and I'm sure beyond, is what does Berlin make of the European Union common policy towards Iran? And perhaps more importantly, is there such a thing as a European Union policy towards Iran? Azadeh, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex. Thank you to the Middle East Institute and Chatham House for organizing this event. I'm very happy to be here. Starting with Germany's outlook on Iran and German Iran policy in general, we would have to say that Germany's Iran policy is very much focused on the nuclear issue and has basically been so since more or less 2003. Berlin has been very keen back then to prevent another North Korean scenario where we would put additional burden on the non-proliferation treaty and the non-proliferation regime. They were very keen to prevent another military escalation. So a lot of the German policy emphasis has been lying on preventing these kind of major nuclear proliferation crises, not just in Iran, but also with regard to the Middle East. And this could be seen as, a bit of a shortcoming of German Iran policy, because there has been so much emphasis on the nuclear issue. Other issues that are also, of course, of concern for Berlin, including Iran's ballistic missile program, including Iran's regional activities, the human rights situation in Iran, have been somewhat neglected, if you will, because so much policy time was taken by the nuclear issue. And I would say this is still the case. Even though, and maybe later on we'll talk about that a little bit, discussions and debates in Berlin are shifting a little bit. I think with regard to other concerns, the missile issue and regional activities, obviously the safety of Israel is of particular concern to Iran, to Germany. More so, I would assume then that will be an issue for the UK or France. So that's a particular issue in the German debate. I think if we look back at German foreign ministers, we had one particular case where one former German minister made it very clear that there could never be normalized relations between Germany and Iran as long as the Islamic Republic does not recognize Israel as a state. So we have the issue of Israel playing a role here in Iran and Germany's Iran policy. Overall, though, there is actually not really a very specific German Iran policy. Germany acts very much within the framework of the European Union and the E3 in particular. And there was, in fact, a common European approach towards Iran, very much based on preventing a non-proliferation crisis. And I think we can say that Europeans have been consistent in this nuclear policy, and they are basically the reason why we probably still have a nuclear agreement today. They were the ones in 2003 starting negotiations. They were the ones keeping the deal most actively alive when the United States decided to withdraw from its own obligations. And I think a lot of burden will be on Europe right now, including Germany, to try to conquer this kind of transitional phase that we are in right now, to prevent the deal and ideally build upon it.
Thank you, Azadeh. Just a quick follow-up question, I guess, from me. If you read Iranian press over the last 2-3 years, certainly since the Trump administration came to office, there is this sense of deep Iranian resentment. At least that's how they put it, that they're angry that Europe doesn't have the courage to stand up to the United States. They feel like the Europeans are where they are in terms of their policy just because of the personality of the occupant in the White House. But the reality is, if you go back to the whole critical dialogue, going back to the 1990s, if not before, certainly you can go back all the way to 1979, Europe has always had its own concerns about the nature and behavior of the Islamic Republic. And you pointed out one issue that really is the elephant in the room. The fact that the Islamic Republic refuses to recognize a regional neighboring state that's a member of the United Nations, namely Israel. Now, I don't want to sit here defend or attack Israel, but the fact is, as you pointed out, European Union, in terms of its policy, I mean, how on earth are they going to have normal or anything that looks like normal relations with the Islamic Republic when the Ayatollah Khamenei and Revolutionary Guard certainly have such a hawkish stance? And let me just say one thing, Azadeh, and specifically I want you to react to this. Recently, the daughter of the late Ayatollah Rafsanjani was the most prominent who came out and said, we have to change our position on Israel. It just doesn't make sense. And I'm sure she was talking about what's going on in the region. Why doesn't Europe try and encourage that debate and say to the Iranians, okay, we might learn to live with Islamic Republic, but there are certain things you need to do. There are certain adjustments you really have to make if you want us to be on your side. What do you make of that? Could you see the Germans help in that regard?
I mean, first of all, I think we should acknowledge that when we look at the European Union with a number of member states, it's not just Germany, right? And I think the question of Israel is of much higher concern to Berlin, for instance, than it is for a number of other European member states, where the safety of Israel or Iran's stance on Israel and recognizing the Israeli state isn't just that high, priority, because there are so many other crises going on in the Middle East, so many other issues and concerns vis-a-vis Iran that they feel like we should, first address other issues here. And if you look at the European position, even, during the nuclear negotiations, the nuclear deal was never meant to be the end point of European-Iranian relations. It was meant to be a starting point from which we would be able to address other issues that were of concern, including regional activities. That's not just Israel, but a number of other crises in the region that need to be addressed, including Iran's ballistic missile program, including Iran's human rights violations. But the view from Berlin, at least, is that through US policy of maximum pressure, the Trump administration has actually tried to shake the very foundation of the nuclear deal that was meant to be a building block to address other issues. And it made it virtually impossible to find common ground and, kind of produce something like a common transatlantic approach vis-a-vis Iran. We have wasted a lot of resources and time these past years through this kind of transatlantic rift, time that could have been better spent to address all those issues, of which one you've mentioned now, that we could have addressed more effectively, more efficiently, more timely if there had been transatlantic cooperation. I think this is where we need to get back to this, to a phase where we can see more transatlantic cooperation, a more unified stance, no more, this unity in the United Nations Security Council, disunity when it comes to this kind of strategic outlook towards Iran, because all of this only harms our position and our ability to be more effective on such issues that you've just mentioned.
Well, thank you so much. Now let me turn to Paris. Clement, if you heard Azadeh, and I don't want to, I'm sure you heard what she said, but I understood that to mean that a lot of focus in Berlin was on the nuclear issue, but that the debate is shifting. I wondered if that is also happening in France. Is the debate in Paris also shifting? And let me just add to that. If it is shifting, then you're not going to be that far away from the Trump administration's policy. You might have differences in terms of methods. How do you go about it? Do you simply put all your eggs in the basket of, unilateral American sanctions, or something else? I mean, that's a disagreement. That's a legitimate disagreement. But it seems like, from what I heard Azadeh describe, that it might be going in that direction, that you just cannot limit yourself to the nuclear issue. And you say what, Clement?
I fully agree with what Azadeh said also, that since 2003, France, Germany, and UK, chose with the Troika to appear as a mediator for the nuclear issue. But I think the difference with Germany is that in France, between 2005 and 2007, a new group of diplomats took over the Iran file. They're very close to the American neoconservative on this issue. So I think on the substance, they really agree with the Trump administration, but it's a question of sovereignty. They cannot tell it publicly because, they had to follow Obama just after this SWIFT policy in 2005, 2007. So in 2009, it was very difficult for France to accept the new Iran policy of the Obama administration because it was the opposite of Sarkozy and Merkel also. We call at the time Merkozy, you remember? Mm-hmm. And it was the rise of a tougher position from France, and maybe we took the lead at the European level. The first unilateral European sanction against Iran date back this period. And I think at the time, what is different from now is that France was pressuring French companies to cut ties with the Islamic Republic. So the ideological aspect of nuclear proliferation took over the defense of French economic interests in Iran. And this was very new for Total, Gaz de France, all the big French companies that had these ties since the 1990s, because after the end of the Iraq War, Iran-Iraq War, France took some distance, with Saddam Hussein. So the idea in 91, 92 was to balance the friendship between France and Iraq with a new relationship with Iran. And this finished in 2007 with Sarkozy. And again, Trump arrived after Fabius, Laurent Fabius, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs. We were talking about Israel. He was a closer to Israel. He was telling Israeli what's going on during the negotiation with JCPOA. And he's very proud of that. He's publishing articles about how close he was with Netanyahu and how skeptical he was about the nuclear deal. So France did its maximum to prevent the signing of JCPOA. Of course, they rewrite history today and they say it's a better deal thanks to France. But it's not exactly the case. And if you read John Kerry's memoir, you will see about the fight between Fabius and John Kerry when France learned about the secret channel between the US and Iran in Oman. So Kerry used the word French were pissed off. So you see that France was obliged by the US to change the Iran policy again in 2015. So I think at the time, French companies were leading the opening, but against the will of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I think in France, there is different position between Bercy, the Minister of Economic Affairs, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense. And what the Trump withdrawal from JCPOA produced is that President Macron had at this time to propose a new, JCPOA plus, what they call nuclear plus. In France, is nuclear élargi. And this nuclear plus idea is what Azadeh said, to rebalance between nuclear issue, regional policy, ballistic program, and human rights. But this brings the European closer to the Trump administration and makes them more dependent on the Trump administration. Because the Iranians, as you said, are really angry against this change of position. And they say that they're playing good cop, bad cop again. Good cop was Obama, and bad cop was France at the time. And now France is good cop, and the US is bad cop. So there is this idea that France and the US are the two faces of the same coin. It's what you can read in the conservative press in Iran. And I think that France was not able to protect the French company. So they're very talkative on the international scene about what we can do at the European level. We should, they call it Instex, the beginning of something. But at the end of the day, they are not delivering because they don't prevent the French company to leave the Iranian market. And I don't see what Iranian can expect from Europe, given this lack of economic sovereignty.
You know, Clement, the United States hasn't been in Iran diplomatically since, obviously, the revolution in '79. So at this point, I'm sure there are American commercial interests in one way or another, should there one day be an opportunity to go back to that Iranian market of 85 million people. But frankly, commercial American interests have learned to ignore Iran pretty much. I mean, I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. But tell me a little bit more about and I don't want to, again, put words in your mouth, but you described the ideological group of people that came in the mid-2000s. Can you say, give us some insights into how that ideologically driven worldview, certainly on Iran, clashed or did not with commercial interests in France that, do have the option of going into Iran if the opportunities present themselves? How would you describe that? And where is that today? I mean, is that a relevant factor? Is there competition to shape French foreign policy on Iran today? I mean,
Yeah, I think that the problem is not an issue of, this group of people, group of diplomats in the French political system. We have technocrats. So one difference with the US is that when there is a change of administration, there is a change of analysts, change of staff, But in France, the staff remains the same. So there is no change of people dealing with the Iranian issue. So if you look at the Iran group of John Bolton or the new security advisor, they're very different than from Obama people dealing with Iran. But in France, when you have Sarkozy, Hollande, or Macron, you have the same group of people in charge of the Iran issue. And this is, I think, the main problem, because these people think since the beginning that the JCPOA is dead, that there is no possibility to negotiate with a state like the Islamic Republic, that is a waste of time. And when the company went to Iran, they tried their best to prevent them to go first. Laurent Fabius was talking about economic diplomacy, but this was valid for all over the world except Iran. So the business delegations that went to Iran at the beginning, before JCPOA, 2014-15, were going on their own. And this was something you have to understand, because the group of people I mentioned were really afraid of that. And when Trump was elected, it was an opportunity for them. Even if Macron at the same time was talking about the role of France as a mediator and everything, this group of people became closer to the US. But at the same time, they couldn't follow publicly the US because of the sovereignty of the state, because France gave its words with JCPOA, and they cannot, change their policy twice because of change of administration in the US. It's too visible, So what happened is that they didn't protect the French companies that were in Iran. They were talking about the beginning of something new at the European level. And they were talking to the Iranian about the prospect maybe to have independent trade relationship in 10 years, 20 years. But Total was not able to buy Iranian oil anymore. So what I wonder now is, even if Biden is elected, what the Iranian can expect from the EU? Because what they want is not the support of Macron or Merkel. They want the French companies, the German companies going back and compete with the Chinese company. But I really doubt that these companies will go back to Iran if the problem between Iran and the US is not solved, because they will not trust the European institution and the French state to protect them from external pressure. So I think that this is a missed opportunity, and it will take time to go back, I think, to the Iranian market or to the dream of the Iranian market. I think we need to wait 10 years for the business community to decide, because it was very costly. It took them a lot of time, and they have invested a lot of energy for nothing. Yeah. So I think this bad experience will have significant effects in the next decade.
Right. Thank you so much. I mean, you raise a lot of good questions, and one of them we definitely will get back to, the issue of how Europe perceives the rising influence of China. Well, actually, at this point, we're beyond rising. We're quite talking about the domination of China, of Iran, and what that means for European interests. But we get to that later on. And one of the other things you talked about is, frankly, we can sit here and talk about Europe, US. End of the day, a lot of those commercial decisions are based on the health of the marketplace, what you're confronted with on the ground. And that's Iran's problem, frankly. And I think, but that's a separate issue. Let me not get started on that. Let me turn to London and Sanam, who will tell us that despite Brexit, the United Kingdom still has enough energy to have an Iran policy. Sanam, where are we today in London? Is there any bandwidth left, or how much is there in terms of dealing with the Iran issue as Britain undergoes this process of divorcing from the rest of the European Union?
Thank you, Alex. These are the big questions that seem to be on the table today and tomorrow, actually, for the UK and Europe, as they consider effectively how to divorce amicably or not. But I think that the issue of the UK, is a really interesting case study here. We're talking about the EU being caught between Washington and Tehran. And I think the UK situation is also quite particular, because it's not just caught between Washington and Tehran, but also with Europe. And there was an expectation, I think, from the Trump administration that the UK would break from Berlin and Paris and side with the United States over the withdrawal from the JCPOA, and then on every subsequent issue that emerged over the past 2-year period. And except for the United Kingdom siding with the US on the US maritime mission that came together last summer to protect shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, the UK has walked effectively in lockstep with Berlin and Paris. And this has raised some eyebrows in Washington, if not more, about the strength of the special relationship, that relationship that has been important historically. And it's also, of course, I think, made people question the direction of the UK's policy through this divorce period from Europe, and its future role in vis-a-vis Iran, but also with the Arab Gulf states that it has had traditionally stronger ties with. The reality is that I don't necessarily have defined answers for you, because Brexit has been a big impediment. There has been much resources that have been diverted to Brexit. And then, of course, the COVID crisis, as London is on the brink of another sort of temporary lockdown, we found out today, is posing a huge challenge for the British government to sort of define what post-Brexit Britain is about. They're supposedly trading opportunities that are out there. Obviously, though, it's a question of priorities, and Iran is not a huge priority for a British trade. It hasn't had a strong history of trade for decades now, frankly, as Britain has prioritized its relations with the Arab Gulf states, but obviously with Europe and the United States. Britain is caught up, and it believes in supporting the JCPOA. It believes in the strong multilateral nature of that agreement. But it also sees that the Iran puzzle has to be solved with Berlin and Paris. It shares the same concerns of Iran's human rights violations, of Iran's ballistic missile program. It is equally worried about Iran's regional activities and sees Iran as a destabilizer in the Middle East. But frankly, the belief is that the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement has posed much more challenges. They have had to withdraw resources that they would have devoted to try to address some of those issues. And the U.S. is sort of maybe being dismissive of the importance of Europe. And we've seen that over the past few years in Washington in particular. But they're also underestimating the level of frustration and anger in these capitals. And I think it will be hard to rebuild some of that trust back if and when negotiations ever come back to the table.
Oh, thank you, Sanam. I mean, you actually kind of raised an issue that I wanted to sort of take in the next round, but I'll start beginning with you now, the issue of sovereignty. I mean, the hurt feelings, if you will, of the European Union member states, the way they were treated by the Trump administration, that, they were told, this is what you're going to do, and it doesn't really matter how you feel about it. How much of that is really much bigger than Iran? It's not just about Iran. It's, like you said, and others have said, it's about European sovereignty. Where is that debate today for UK in particular, given its kind of position in the gray zone, if you will?
I think it is a huge issue, definitely also at a popular level. I think people are really frustrated or don't appreciate the sort of bullying approach of the Trump administration. And I also we've been sort of watching Tehran also try to play on this issue of sovereignty. And you can hear the Supreme Leader and his very strong attacks on Europe trying to sort of challenge the Europeans to stand up on this issue of sovereignty at the same time. I think that, the UK is in this awkward moment. It would like to demonstrate its sovereignty. It talks a very big game on sovereignty. But right now, Britain, is prioritizing its economic recovery and its trade agreements that it needs more than anything. So it's unclear how it's going to be able to assert its sovereignty. We're in this sort of crisis of leadership, and perhaps Britain doesn't have the position to take that bold step. I thought that perhaps Boris Johnson could have picked up where President Macron left off and tried to sort of shepherd or take the hand of Washington and Tehran and try to bring them together. But, domestic events and COVID have led the UK down a different path right now. So they're really kind of stuck, and their best bet remains cooperation with Berlin and Paris. And, much depends on what happens in November in the United States. And I think that, you're going to go here, but I'm just going to take you here sooner. November is going to define the issue of sovereignty for Europe and the UK. I think that's going to force them to take one of the two roads, that is in front of them.
Great. Thank you. No, you're right. We will talk about the sort of scenarios post 3rd of November and US elections, but let me go back to Azadeh and start a new round, and I'll start looking at the questions in a minute. Azadeh, what would you say has been the impact of, the pulling out of the nuclear deal? Let's just for the sake of argument, which I think it more could have been asked of Tehran at the time of JCPOA in 2015. But let's just say that was the best deal you could have had. It happened pretty much at the same time as the big flow of refugees started coming from the Middle East for Europe. I'm just wondering, in terms of psychology of this, how much anxiety was there in Berlin and elsewhere, to your knowledge? And I'll ask the same question of everyone else about, look, United States is protected by the Atlantic Ocean. And we're dealing with a number of crises around us on Europe's borders. We can't afford a country like Iran to potentially break apart. We can't have vacuum on that scale. How much was that, or continues to be a factor in wanting Germany to, have at least a central government in place in Tehran, as opposed to a Libya situation or something similar?
I mean, the so-called refugee crisis that we saw in Europe has certainly had an impact on domestic political discourse in Germany. I think it was probably a very defining moment for the general public as well, when people realized that there are even individual situations in Europe, in Central Europe, might be affected by events in the Middle East and, you know, places that are farther away. And this has certainly impacted and shaped German political debate, for sure. I don't see that much of an impact directly related to the Iran issue in 2015 at that point when it comes to this refugee issue. But certainly, as I said, on a broader scale, when we talk about foreign policy discourse, this has played a role. For Germany at that time, it was more of a security issue when it comes to questions of proliferation rather than a security issue when it comes to migration with regard to Iran or refugees with regard to Iran. That was the main issue. Sanam already indicated this isn't really about economics here from the European perspective. Yes, sure, European companies have not been able to achieve what they wished for, but European trade has already been quite low. This has always been a security issue for European Union rather than an economic issue. And just to bring us back, I mean, in the 1990s, if we look at Iran's trade relations back then, this is when Europe was strong. Germany, UK, Italy, they were some of the main trading partners for Iran. Today, it's China, Turkey, and the UAE. It's completely different actors here. And basically, we lost a lot of ground to China also in 2011, 2012, when we joined the oil embargo vis-a-vis Iran. So already we are at a severe, if you will, disadvantage when it comes to economics. And I totally agree with Clément. Companies will not, storm back into the Iranian market, even under a Biden administration. This takes much more time to create the kind of security that is needed for these types of companies to go back. This will have repercussions also when it comes to, leverage and the kind of influence that we might have. But to come back to your question of refugees, yes, on a general discourse level, it had an impact, but that was not the main concern of Berlin, and I'm sure also not the main concern of Paris and London when it came to the nuclear issue and the general issue of Iran.
And Azad, let me, while I have you, because I'll ask the question of Clément in a minute about sovereignty, and I'll ask him this question as well. Mark has a question, and he's asking us, organizations like the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or I'm sure similar organizations, similar regional sort of structures, security structures, what role they could play in the future of the Middle East. Sort of, I guess, the question I'm assuming is asking about being able to reduce tensions. But let me ask the question slightly differently. What role can Germany and other European Union countries play, or maybe are already playing, in sort of mediating between some of these countries in the region? I mean, I certainly don't know of any, it's not in the open sources. I'm an open source guy. Maybe you have your contacts will tell you different, but I don't sense that the Europeans are trying to sort of broker, not peace, but reduce tensions between, say, Iran and Saudi Arabia. I mean, we talked about the issue of sovereignty for Europe and where it feels or where it stands, but what about being a bit more proactive and taking the role? Because I say this to you because just last week on Friday, Javad Zarif was in China, and the Chinese again put forward the idea of China being at the forefront on creating a regional formula for dialogue. Now it's become China's role to do that. We wouldn't have expected that 10 years ago. But where's Europe in all of this?
First of all, I don't believe that Europe has a decisive role to play when it comes to mediating among Middle Eastern actors here. Certainly Germany doesn't, because it does require more leverage and more kind of influence than at least Berlin possesses. It might be a little bit different for France, and I think Clément can say a little bit about that, and maybe Macron's more proactive approach. But this is certainly not the Angela Merkel approach or Berlin's approach, at least right now. I think the best kind of support that Europeans can lend in general is when it comes to give, multilateral kind of formats, the kind of framing that brings different parties together that go beyond just Middle Eastern parties. So when we talk about mediating within the Middle East, as I said, I don't see a certain or special German role. But when it comes to facilitating talks with the United States, and then at some point potentially with other actors as well, where we would address issues that go beyond the nuclear issue, this is where I still believe Europe can play a role. First of all, I think, and we will probably talk about a little bit more in depth later on when we talk about Biden versus Trump presidency. But first of all, I think Europe right now has the time and capacity to build some kind of time frame and framework with Iran to build the path towards some sort of talks between the United States and Iran, which are inevitable. I mean, if we want to get out of this nuclear crisis, we have to find some kind of understanding between Iran and the United States. And from there, we can take it from there. I just don't see any effective approach in the region or other areas when we can't even tackle this very, very big elephant in the room first. I think that's a prerequisite. But in that realm, I think Europe can play a role. It can provide the platform, because Khamenei has said time and again that he officially, at least, does not accept bilateral direct talks between Iran and the United States, but he has never ruled out multilateral formats. This is where Europe can be the binding bridge. Furthermore, I do believe that Europe, despite all its shortcomings, and I think we all agree that they don't have the economic sovereignty that will be needed to provide substantial financial relief to Iran. I think that's a given. But they have actually regained some credibility, particularly with their very clear stance in the United Nations Security Council. And they have proven that they are serious when it comes to upholding the nuclear agreement. They are the ones that have been consistent, and we heard from Sanam, even despite Brexit, they have been consistent among the E3, consistent among the European Union in their stance on their policy, and this will carry some weight when we enter talks with Iran on any issue, nuclear, regional, ballistic missiles. You need to have some actors at the table who, entertain some degree of credibility, because the United States has frankly lost all.
Thank you, Azadeh. And let me turn to Clement. Please, anything you want to add in terms of the issue of sovereignty of Europe? And also, if you want to sort of perhaps give us your thoughts in terms of the possibility of a greater European role in mediating among some of these states. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, France surely is one of the top trading partners of the Gulf states, for example, alongside with Britain. So you have some leverage. You also have security, military ties with some of the Gulf states. So France does have some leverage. But anyway, that's so the sovereignty issue and possible mediation. Please.
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question. I think I'm French, but I got my PhD from Switzerland. So I will tell you that the Swiss are the real mediator for three reasons. First, they're not a political player. They're not a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. Second, they're very discreet. That President Macron, he likes to show off, to go with President Trump, to have a dinner, to talk with the media about what he's doing with Iran. So he's using Iran as a PR for the French people, because the French people love to have, an independent state following the model of Charles de Gaulle. So every French president tried to be the new Charles de Gaulle, but it's not working. Sarkozy tried it also in 2007. The goal of Sarkozy was to reconcile Ahmadinejad and W. Bush. So Velayati came to Paris, Ali Akbar Velayati, the diplomatic advisor of Khamenei, the Supreme Leader, so the one you need to talk with. And he came back to Tehran, and he was very surprised what he heard by Sarkozy, He was shocked, because Sarkozy was at the same time going closer to the US, to the W. Bush administration, asking French companies to leave Iran, and trying to be a mediator. So you see, you cannot do everything at the same time. So there is a bit of confusion when France is trying to play this role as a mediator. So Swiss is the best hope, and you have to know that the French diplomatic apparatus is really against any Swiss mediation. So they always complain about the Swiss. And what we talk about nuclear plus, Iran, nuclear file, ballistic missile, regional policy, and human rights was the idea, at the beginning of the 2000s of the grand bargain. And it didn't work. That's why the Obama administration chose to negotiate only on the nuclear issue, and you got the JCPOA, it was successful. So it's very bizarre that after Trump withdrew from JCPOA, this old idea of grand bargain came back on the table. Everyone knew it's not working. So it was very surprising that President Macron brings that to President Trump. But the idea, it was to avoid talking about the elephant in the room that, as I mentioned, the fact that EU or European in general state can play a role only with the support of the US. Because what happened in 2005, is that John Bolton, already John Bolton, so the very same of the Trump administration, asked the Europeans to stop their negotiation. And you have the end of the first role of Europe as a mediator because of the lack of US support. So it's very difficult because we don't have the economic sovereignty we got in the 1990s. And the Clinton administration also was different than the Trump administration in terms of pressuring European companies. So I think that it will be very difficult to play this mediating role for Europe. And I don't see China playing this role. I see Russia. Because I think Russia has this ability today in today Middle East to talk with Israel, Iran, UAE, Saudi Arabia at the same time. And you see on Syria, for instance, participate to track two diplomatic meetings between American and Iranian, and it was in Moscow. And they can negotiate, ceasefire in Syria. They can negotiate some agreement through Russia. But I don't see Beijing playing this role because I think the Chinese are looking more for economic benefits. What they want to avoid is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz because they're the main importers of oil. So they have energy interest there. But I think that Russia can provide the platform for this kind of diplomatic encounters.
Well, thank you so much. Let me if you could, Clement, maybe give me a quick answer on this one, in the interest of time. But I'm really curious. How do you see a possible JCPOA 2.0? And we talk about the elections in a minute, but just in your mind, how is that? Because the Iranians are saying, we're not going to go back to the deal of 2015 either. So what do you think realistically could come out of a new round of talks and a new nuclear deal? How would that be different?
I think it will be a limited agreement, just for instance, to restart the oil export. So if there is a Biden administration, they can negotiate a limited agreement, more plus for plus, or Iran apply a little bit more limitation to its nuclear program, and the US allow a new oil export from Iran. But I don't see any trust between the two players. I don't see any political will on the Iranian side to compromise again because of lack of trust. But there is no solution for Iran. So at the same time, there is no alternative. So this is a paradox of the Iranian position. They have an economic incentive to talk with the US, but it's an issue also of pride. It's very difficult for the Islamic Republic to sell to its own people the fact that after the betrayal of the US, they have to renegotiate with them. So it's a very difficult issue in terms of internal bargaining inside the Islamic Republic. So I don't see in the short term a new JCPOA, but at the same time, Iran cannot also appear as a state that pursues a nuclear bomb. So this is also another difficulty for Iran, a technical one. When they reduce their commitments, they don't have to show any will to go to build a military program, because that will provide a lot of room to maneuver for the enemy of the Islamic Republic and could start a new war also in the Middle East. So it's a very difficult game on both sides, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Sanam, I mean, to that point, I tend to agree with Clement that I don't see much of a, I mean, if anybody's expecting Ayatollah Khamenei to pave the way for better relations with the United States when there's a President Biden, for example, show me the evidence. I mean, and I think a lot of this, as we probably all agree here, is about Iranian domestic politics. The Ayatollah Khamenei uses the American card for domestic political control, more so to advance Iranian national interest, which frankly doesn't gain at all from this standoff with the US. But here's my question as well for you, Sanam. What do you think? Are you, are you going to agree with Clement that, it will be another effort to buy time? Yes, you can sell oil, but stay away from increasing the number of centrifuges you have, which frankly doesn't seem very reassuring as a security, agreement going forward.
Yeah, sadly, I do agree with Clément. I think that we all, have been watching Iran for long enough that we recognize the domestic constraints that Iran is under and the security constraints. I think the policy establishment inside Iran is under pressure, obviously economically, and having a deal that gives it enough oxygen while it tries to resolve some of its internal challenges is really important. Simultaneously, Iran faces elections next year for the presidency, and it has its own succession clock. That is important. Khamenei, the Supreme Leader, is aging, and thinking about how that succession issue plays out, I think is a very pressing issue for the policy establishment and hardliners within the Islamic Republic. So that is an equal priority. So how they balance the internal dynamics against the economic pressures and the need to find an off-ramp with the United States, I think is going to be sort of very delicate and thereby limited. They can make some concessions, but nothing too extraordinary. They need some sanctions relief, but we can't expect the whole portfolio of issues to be resolved in a meaningful way until there is greater consensus and security, perhaps within the system itself.
Right. Thank you, Salam.
Alex?
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, if I may, could I add some points also on this question of Iran negotiations and how efficient or useful those will be? First of all, I agree that's particularly difficult for Iran to come back and negotiate, but I think we should still maintain that Iran is in fact still interested in finding some sort of political understanding with the United States. And part of their response and the tactical shift that we've seen in their nuclear policy since May of 2019 has been to build the kind of leverage they need to not get back to the negotiation table empty-handed. That's what's important for Iran. That's what we've seen in the Persian Gulf with the kind of retaliatory acts that Iran pursued. That's what we've seen with Iran ramping up its nuclear program. It needs this sort of, leverage, something in their hands so they can come and discuss and negotiate, not out of a position of weakness. I think that's particularly important to the Iranian leadership here. But a lot will also depend on messaging. And I just want to, lay out three basic challenges that I think we are facing with regard to negotiations with Iran, which are not to say that we won't have any chance of success. I firmly believe that there's a chance that we can find ways to de-escalate and come back to some sort of, stronger compliance here from all sides. Challenge number one is the question of compensation. I think Clément already indicated we will not go back to the status quo ante. I think nobody really wants that, neither United States nor Iran. So Iran demands some sort of financial or other compensation for the losses that they have suffered in their own view through the sanctions regime. And in fact, they did suffer losses here. Secondly, I think what Iran will emphasize and stress on is some sort of assurance, some sort of built-in mechanisms that secure Iran's sanctions relief this time around, that there are mechanisms in play that do not allow one party to violate its commitments, as the United States did, without Iran having any sanctioning possibility or any possibility to respond in any way. So this will be important for Iran. And thirdly, I think the question of sequencing. Iran, in contrast to 2015, this time will not take the first step. They will demand that the United States takes the first step. This could be, for instance, issuing oil waivers. That could be used for domestic messaging as well, saying, okay, the United States are taking first steps. Then and only then will we be willing to take one step of our own, one of the many cards that we have assembled throughout these past year, more than a year of leverage building. And this is how we need to move forward step by step. So all I'm trying to say is we shouldn't be too pessimistic here. I think there are creative ways to move forward. But I agree that it's going to be incredibly difficult. I do not expect any fast kind of successes here, particularly prior to the Iranian elections. And just bear in mind that nuclear negotiations took 12 years and about 2 concrete years of hardcore negotiation when it came to the JCPOA. And now we are talking about much more than the nuclear issue. So it will take a long time.
Thank you, Azadeh. And since I have you, let me ask another question of you for this new round. The pessimist in me says Ayatollah Khamenei has had plenty of time the last 31 years to have a dialogue with Washington. He's had plenty of opportunities. Not only has he not taken those opportunities, he stifled every president who served while he was Supreme Leader, from Rafsanjani to Mohammad Khatami to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to Hassan Rouhani, who famously had to apologize for having a 15-minute phone call with Obama. Ayatollah Khamenei sees America not, as I said, in my view, as a foreign policy issue, but something that literally, if it goes out of his control, will weaken his hand. And I think the time right now is particularly bad for him because he wants to prepare the ground going forward for the succession process. He believes the continuation of the Islamic Republic is his #1 priority. And having the US embassy come back to Tehran could jeopardize everything for him, which is why he's so keen on his so-called Eastern policy of Russia and China, which takes me to my question. And more broadly, the Iranians, certainly Khamenei sees China as Iran's savior. We can debate this. I think the facts are very contradictory in terms of how much China does to save Iran. But what are Europe's concerns about rising Chinese influence in Iran, in the Middle East broadly, for European political and commercial interest? I mean, what is your sense? Because I think Clement talked about, they're only worried about, the Chinese are only worried about the Strait of Hormuz not being closed, so they get their oil. Is that really all they're about? I mean, a rising global China surely wants to do a little bit more than just worried about the flow of oil in the Middle East. But let's hear from Berlin.
Okay, on the issue on China, maybe let's start by saying that I don't really agree that Iran sees China as a savior. Iran is certainly looking for a partner in China, one that it can count on economically and ideally also geopolitically. And we are not there yet. I think part of the discussion that we see nowadays about Iran and China is absolutely overhyped and out of proportion. We are not even close to anything like a strategic partnership between Iran and China. What we see is mostly transactional. But let me get to the point of where I think China does play a major role, something that we should watch from the perspective of Berlin and Europe in general. You might find it odd that a country like the Islamic Republic, which is an Islamic Republic, would seek out a country like China, a secular kind of communist state. So you wouldn't necessarily expect many ideological commonalities, but there are commonalities when it comes to ideas of international order and geopolitics. And Iran very much welcomes China's rise on the international arena and this very rapid rise of China. We should not forget Iran is a revisionist power. It's a power that actually tries to change the status quo, and it regards China as the one power that is able and has the capacity to change the status quo of international order. China, on the other hand, does acknowledge Iran as a regional power and in fact gives Iran a quite central role in its own Belt and Road Initiative, something that Iran very much agrees with, very much prefers, as it sees it as kind of a revision of its historic role. So there's a very specific of overlap of Iranian geopolitical interest and Chinese geopolitical interest. And I think what we haven't seen in Iran yet enough is, a deeper discussion of long-term geopolitical consequences of these. So far, Iran is looking to China mostly through the lens of sanctions and, long-term ideas of how this could affect world order, but not so much about how it could affect Iranian sovereignty along the way. Still, I think this is what we need to look at a little bit more specifically. Not just China's economic power in Iran, but also some of the overlap when it comes to geopolitical issues. And the last point that might be challenging for Europe is that, of course, in contrast to European-Iranian relations, Sino-Iranian relations do not depend on Iran discussing human rights issues, do not depend on Iran recognizing Israel as a sovereign state, do not depend on Iran, discussing its ballistic missile program. So naturally, it's much easier for Iran to lean on a country like China and seek stronger, deeper relationships than it would be to find this kind of relationship in Europe that doesn't even show interest in normalizing relations with it.
Thank you, Azadeh. We have about 5 or so minutes left. So let me start with Clement. This is going to be the last round. And I guess, Clement, by all means, if you want to comment on anything China related, do so. But we also have a question here from Mr. Mehdad Khonsari, who wants to know, in your view, does Iran have another 12 years to negotiate to the point that was made earlier about the last round of negotiations? That's a very good question. When you look at
very good.
Excuse me.
It's a difficult question, but just on China, maybe very quickly, I will say that for Europe, China in Iran can be a business partner. So it's very different than the view from the US. For Total, for instance, the investment in South Pars 11 was along a Chinese company, because they see as an opportunity for the banking relation with Iran, for the ability also to be independent from the US system. So as Total is doing in Russia, working with China, I think for the business community, it's not a threat, China, it's an opportunity in France. So I think on this experience post JCPOA that show that Iranian wants to play the game, as I said before, European economic interest to balance Chinese economic influence that is growing to avoid dependency. This is the discourse of the so-called moderate in Iran, the reformists, to justify the rapprochement with Europe. But it's more complex because a European economic actor will go along China to invest in Iran. On the question of Madame Ronsari, does Iran have 12 years? I think Khamenei is not taking into account the interest of Iran, of the country, his own personal interest and the interest of the system. But it will be, as Ade said, also a question of economic survival. Because you remember after the end of the war with Saddam Hussein, you have this decision to end the war by Khamenei. So many people are saying that it's an ideological state with security interest, domestic, balance, and an ideological preference to challenge the US international order. But at the end of the day, if the price to pay is the end of the Islamic Republic, I think that we can expect also some good surprise and an opportunity for diplomacy. That's why Europe can play a role, because as you saw with the Trump administration, the maximum pressure could lead to a regional war. So Mohammed bin Zayed from the UAE, many regional states asked President Macron also to play this mediating role. So the Gulf states were against, most of them, the JCPOA, but at the same time, they're against an Iran-US war. So there is a space also for Europe, I think, to be the regional international power in the Middle East, and to avoid also another difficult scenario of a war, because there is an economic disaster for Iran that is potentially what Mehrdad mentioned, I think, but also the risk of war. So let's see if Europe can help to avoid a war between Iran and the West.
And Clément, since I have you, and this I'm afraid will be the last time I'll come to you just because time is up, but tell us in a few words briefly, sort of a second Trump administration or a Biden presidency, what do you see changing in any way or shape, perhaps radically going forward?
I think the main difference is that Europe can play the role of a junior partner of a Democrat administration in the US, because the US has a lot of constraints also. We talk about the Islamic Republic, but you have the US Congress that will prevent any business between Iran and the US. So Europe can play the role Obama administration asked them to play. The question is what I mentioned, is the economic actors, private actors of Europe ready to play the game again after the failure of the first opening? And this is very important because if we want to avoid war, we need, I think, a certain level of economic interaction between Iran and the rest of the world. That's why China and Russia maybe are more important, because they have this ability to have the same Iran policy and to avoid the change of policy between US administration. And in the region, I think the popularity of Russia, of Vladimir Putin, can be counterintuitive, but it's also the result of political stability, because with the US, there is a lot of change. So I think there is a question here about the ability of the US to provide stability and security in the future. And the Israel-UAE deal and the Israel-Bahrain deal is also the result of this new instability, new risk of war in the Middle East, I think.
Thank you very much. And let me ask the same question to wrap up, first Sanam and then Azadeh. So Sanam Jan, what do you tell us, a Trump 2.0 or a Biden presidency? What do you see?
Crystal ball gazing 19 days out is always fun. Let's say, obviously, predicting Trump is hard, but I think we will expect a bit more of the same in terms of uncertainty, unpredictability. And I think that that's reflective in the Abraham Accords, as Clement just brought up. I think that America's traditional partners feel increasingly anxious about the role and commitment of the United States in the region. And so they're going it alone together. Between Abu Dhabi and Israel on the one hand, but I think also trying to be relevant in Washington at the same time. And maybe we're going to just see them trying to be the proxies of the United States in the region. Maybe it's a new twin pillars to bring up the whole Nixon-Kissinger policy of the 1960s, 70s. But Trump, at the same time, on the very day he announced the Abraham Accords, let's not forget, reminded the world that he still seeks a bigger deal with Iran. And you know, I think that could be in the cards. And I think that there are people in Tehran that see Trump as an easier deal maker. They could tick fewer boxes and get perhaps more from him. And he would be less bound by legacy, less bound by the election, and more focused on his legacy. So that's an outcome that we have to consider. And I think that America's allies are also considering that. So that's the space I would watch there. And on Biden, I mean, he's been as clear as he can be, compliance for compliance. But I think Azadeh really nailed it. This, what we can expect from Biden is all going to be about messaging, timing, and sequencing. And the timing is against the United States right now because of Iran's election. So whatever sort of win that they can, or whatever trust that they can quickly build with Tehran before the Iranian elections is going to be important, because Iranian elections are always unpredictable. And we always make the mistake and assume things are always going to go one way in Tehran. And I think the second piece that is really important for the Biden team is that they're going to try to learn the lessons of what went wrong with the Obama administration. They're not going to be Obama 2.0. So they recognize that a deal that didn't work through Congress is problem number one, and a deal that didn't work with the region is problem number two. So how they try to address the regional piece is going to be the key. And the key is to try to bring and link and incentivize all of the regional players to that table. And that's, of course, going to be the hardest piece of this puzzle to make happen.
Well, thank you, Sanam. And finally, Azadeh, in Berlin, same question, the continuation of the Trump administration versus the Biden presidency. Tell us, how do you see it perhaps unfold?
I mean, first of all, regardless of whoever wins, even if it's a Biden administration that actually has said they want to go for compliance, I don't see any smooth negotiations moving forward. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to move forward with Iran. There will be a lot of challenges ahead, a lot of escalatory measures taken on different sides, a lot of pressure domestically, both in Iran and the US. So it's not going to be easy. And secondly, again, regardless of who wins, I don't think transition will be smooth in the United States either. I think it will probably take some time before we even know the actual results, who would actually be the president, who would actually have the time and capacity to nominate necessary people, to build up their own team, to start, any kind of talks. And this is where Europe comes in. This is where we have to play a role. We are the ones who have the capacity right now to keep the communication lines with Iran open, to try to de-escalate, to invest in, working on a common path towards some sort of negotiation framework and timetable. This is where we are needed to bridge this very delicate, I think very difficult time that lies ahead of us between the US elections and the Iranian elections in summer of 2021.
Well, thank you so much, Azadeh. We certainly covered a lot of ground. I've just written down here, we covered a lot of ground in terms of European Union, Iran relations, obviously bilateral relations between Germany, France, UK. We talked about broader European Union sovereignty issues and options for the United States and Europe to work together going forward on Iran and perhaps other international issues. But on the question of Iran, frankly, so much will obviously depend on what Tehran chooses to do. And on that one, I'm on the skeptical side. I don't see the signs of a rethink in Tehran. I see the end of the so-called reformists and moderates. Anybody in Tehran who the last few decades wanted to engage with Europe, they're as weak today as they've ever been and as irrelevant. The future, probably the next president of Iran will come from the Revolutionary Guards. These are people who look to Russia and China to be safe domestically in Iran. And I guess I'm skeptical, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they will want to change their foreign policy, change their priorities. But that's all for another discussion. I want to thank you all three for a wonderful discussion today. Azadeh in Berlin, Clement in Paris, and Sanam in London. Thank you so much for your insight, giving us the time. Thanks for all the questions that came in today. I'm sorry if I couldn't take them all, but we only had an hour. But again, thank you for joining us today at this joint first, maybe it's not first, maybe I'm wrong, Middle East Institute Chatham House event. Hopefully we'll do more. Again, thank you so much. And with that, I'll say goodbye and wave you all a happy rest of your week. Thank you.